I dropped the glass. It shattered across the kitchen floor, sharp pieces flying under the table and near the fridge. Some landed close to my bare feet. I stood still, heart pounding, not because of the glass, but because of the sound. From the living room, I heard the TV volume go up. Jonas hated noise when he came home. I moved quickly, picking up the biggest pieces, ignoring the sting when one cut my finger. I wiped the blood with a towel and held my breath. Still no footsteps. Only the football match on the screen. I let out a slow breath. Nothing came. That was good. Sometimes nothing was the best I could hope for. This was my daily life now. Quiet panic. Small mistakes. Walking around my own home like a stranger. Our sons, Leo and Ben, were upstairs in their room. They hadn't heard the glass. I was glad. I didn't want them to hear anything. They deserved peace, even if I didn't have it. Years ago, I believed in love. I believed in soft touches and warm words. I believed in Jonas. We married young. I was only 21. He was older, louder, and more confident than anyone I had known. At first, he was kind. He told me I was his world. He gave me flowers and called me his sunshine. But kindness can change its face. I saw it happen slowly. The first year of marriage was quiet. Then came the rules. What clothes I should wear, who I should talk to, what I should say and when. It didn't feel like control at first. It felt like care. That's how it always begins. One evening, I forgot to buy his favorite bread. He shouted, loud, angry words over something so small. I stood still, not knowing what to say. I told myself it was just stress. He had a long day. It would pass, but the shouting didn't stop. It came again and again, over small things. Later, it turned into silence, cold, heavy silence that lasted for days. No words, no smiles, just the sound of the TV and his shoes on the floor. Still, I stayed. When Leo was born, I thought things might get better. For a short time they did. Jonas held the baby with care. He smiled at me. He kissed my forehead. But the softness was brief. He returned to long nights, to cold silences, to words that cut deeper than anything else. Still, I stayed. Ben came 2 years later. I cried when I found out I was pregnant again. I cried not because I didn't love my children. I loved them more than anything. But because I knew I would be tied to this house, to this man, for even longer. I had no job, no income, no family near me. I was alone. Just before we continue, let us know which city and country you are listening this story from, and I would love if you could subscribe. It helps me share more stories like this. My world became small. My days were filled with laundry, cleaning, cooking, and pretending. Pretending everything was okay. Pretending the silence didn't hurt. Pretending the children didn't notice. But they noticed. One afternoon, Leo came to me with a drawing. He had drawn a house, a sun, and 4 smiling stick figures. "We're the best family," he said proudly. I smiled and kissed his head, but later, when I looked at the drawing again, I realized something. The father figure was drawn smaller than the rest. In the corner. Almost forgotten. I began working at a small cafe when Ben started preschool. It was only part-time, but it gave me space to breathe. The manager, Elena, was kind. She didn't ask too many questions, but she looked at me like she knew there was something I wasn't saying. Once, during our lunch break, she said quietly, "You always look tired." I nodded. "It's just the boys. Busy at home." She didn't push, but her eyes said she didn't believe me. She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Concern. That night, I watched my boys sleep. I sat on the edge of their bed, brushing back their hair. I wanted to believe they were happy, but I kept remembering Leo's drawing and his question earlier that week. He had asked why Daddy never smiled at me. I hadn't known what to say. Jonas didn't hit me. He never raised his hand. But there were other ways to hurt. Silence was one of them. Coldness was another. Making someone feel small without saying a word. That was what he did best. One evening, while folding clothes, I overheard him in the next room. He was talking on the phone, his voice sharp and low. He said a woman's name. Natalie. I didn't know anyone by that name. My stomach turned, but I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. As long as he left the boys alone, I could survive anything. Still, I stayed. I knew people would not understand. They would ask, "Why don't you leave?" But they didn't see the full picture. They didn't see Ben's face light up when Jonas lifted him in the air, or how Leo still waited by the window when he heard the car outside. They loved their father. I didn't want to take that away, but something inside me was changing. I was tired of pretending, tired of swallowing words, tired of being the one who held everything together while feeling like I was falling apart. Every time Jonas ignored me, it felt like a quiet erasing, like I was becoming invisible inside my own life. Still, I stayed, but something in me had started to crack. Still, I stayed, but something in me had started to crack. That crack grew deeper when I went to Ben's school one afternoon for parent meetings. I waited outside his classroom, surrounded by other mothers, all smiling and chatting. I stood alone holding my coat, pretending to look at my phone. One of the mothers, Claire, smiled at me and said hello. I smiled back but did not speak much. I did not know how to anymore. I had forgotten how to connect. Later that evening, Ben handed me a small paper from his teacher. "We're doing a class play next month," he said with excitement in his eyes. "Will you come?" I said yes, of course. He looked at me carefully. "Even if Daddy doesn't?" I paused for a moment, unsure what to say. "Yes," I told him softly. "Even if Daddy doesn't." The next morning, I watched Jonas get ready for work. He barely spoke. I packed his lunch, set it on the counter, and waited for him to leave. As the door closed behind him, I let my shoulders drop. The silence he left behind felt easier than the silence he brought home. At work, Elena handed me a small envelope. "I want you to read this later," she said. "No pressure. Just when you're ready." When I got home, I waited until the boys were asleep. I sat at the edge of my bed and opened the envelope. Inside was the name of a counseling center, a simple line in Elena's handwriting. "For when you stop surviving and want to start living." I held the paper in my hand for a long time. That night, I did not sleep well. I lay in bed next to Jonas, who was snoring softly. The distance between us felt like a wall. I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Was I helping the boys by staying, or was I teaching them that love looked like pain? The next day, I picked up the phone and called the number. I did not know what I would say. I did not know what I was asking for. But I knew one thing. I could not keep pretending. Not forever. Maybe not even for much longer. I held the phone to my ear, waiting. A soft voice answered. I did not say much. I gave my name and asked for a morning appointment. That was all I could manage. When I arrived at the counseling center 2 days later, the air inside was warm and quiet. I sat on a soft chair, holding a form in my lap with shaking hands. A woman in her 40s, with calm eyes and a soft smile, called my name. Her name was Marianne. She did not ask hard questions. She did not rush me. She let the silence stretch until I could fill it with something real. I told her about Jonas, about the silence in our house, about the way I disappeared in my own life, about how I stayed for the boys. I had expected to feel shame, but I didn't. I felt tired, and somehow that made the words come easier. Marianne did not tell me to leave. She asked me what I needed. I could not answer. I had not thought about that in years. All my decisions had been shaped around someone else. Jonas, the boys, the idea of family. I had forgotten what I needed. She told me to come back next week. I said yes. At home, nothing had changed. Jonas was still cold, still distant, still disappearing into his phone or the television. But something had shifted in me. I began to see his actions clearly, not as storms I had to survive, but as choices he was making. And I began to ask myself a different question. What were my choices? One night, after dinner, Jonas asked why I was going out again. I told him I had a meeting. He narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He had stopped asking questions about my life long ago. He didn't care enough to notice the truth. That evening, I walked to the cafe after my session. Elena was finishing her shift. She smiled when she saw me. "You okay?" she asked gently. I nodded. "I think so, for the first time in a while." We sat outside for a few minutes, sharing a quiet cup of tea. I told her I was going to counseling. She didn't say "good job" or "I'm proud of you." She just nodded, as if she already knew I would get there when I was ready. Weeks passed. I returned to the center every Tuesday morning. I began to journal again. I started noticing things, how the sunlight hit the floor near the window, how Ben hummed when he played with his toys, how Leo still believed in superheroes. One afternoon, Ben asked if he could sleep in my bed. I let him. He curled against me like he used to when he was smaller. In the dark, he whispered, "Do you ever get sad, Mommy?" I paused. "Sometimes," I said. "Me too," he whispered. "But I don't want you to be sad." I kissed his head. "You make me happy, sweetheart. Every day." That night, I lay awake for a long time. Not because of fear, but because of something new. Clarity. I could not protect my boys from every pain, but I could show them what courage looked like, and that meant facing hard truths. One morning, Marianne asked me if I had ever imagined life without Jonas. I looked down at my hands. "I used to think I couldn't," I said. "But now, I do. Sometimes I imagine waking up in a house that feels calm, where there's no silence that hurts, where I can breathe." She nodded. "It's okay to want peace. That's not selfish. That's human." At home, Jonas continued to drift. He didn't ask where I went. He didn't notice when I smiled more or spoke less. Sometimes I wondered if he even saw me anymore. Then, one afternoon, Leo came home with a paper from school. He had written an essay about a person I admire. He chose me. I sat on the edge of my bed and read it twice, then again. He wrote that I was brave, that I worked hard, that I loved him no matter what. "She's the strongest person I know," he ended. I cried quietly, not because I was sad, but because someone had seen me. Jonas never saw me, but my son did. That night, I watched Jonas fall asleep on the couch. I sat across the room, listening to the soft tick of the clock, and I knew something clearly for the first time. I was going to leave, not out of hate, not out of anger, but out of love, for myself, for Leo, for Ben. I did not want them to grow up thinking this was what love looked like. I wanted them to know it could be soft, kind, respectful. I wanted them to know that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing a person can do. I didn't know how or when, but the decision was there now, and it brought a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I did not leave immediately. It took time. I began to make small changes, things that Jonas barely noticed. I started saving a little money from my cafe job. I asked Elena if I could work more shifts. I told her quietly, "I am planning something." She didn't ask questions. She only nodded. I cleared out a drawer in the hallway, one we never used. Inside, I hid a small notebook, copies of important documents, and a list of steps I would need to take when the time came. Each item I added felt like a small piece of control returning to me. At night, I lay beside Jonas, pretending to sleep. In the dark, I counted breaths. I planned. I repeated one sentence in my mind. I am not staying forever. The boys were my greatest strength and my deepest fear. I knew how much they loved their father. I knew they did not see the full truth. Jonas never shouted at them. He was not unkind to them. But children feel what we do not say. And I had seen the change. Leo's quiet questions, Ben's worried eyes. I had always told myself that staying gave them safety, but I began to ask something harder. What if it gave them confusion instead? During another session, Marianne asked me what freedom looked like. I closed my eyes and answered slowly. It looks like a quiet morning, a table with cereal and milk, no tension, no silence that fills the air like smoke, just peace. She smiled gently. Then that's where you are going. There were moments when I doubted myself, moments when Jonas was calm, when the boys laughed with him, when things felt almost normal. I would sit in those moments and wonder, is it enough? Can I live like this? But the answer always came quietly, clearly, no. On a cold morning in December, I found Leo sitting alone in the hallway. He looked up at me with wide, tired eyes. Are you and Daddy angry again? He asked softly. My heart broke. No, sweetheart, I said, kneeling beside him. We're okay, but thank you for asking. He leaned into me and I held him tightly. I knew I was making the right choice, not for revenge, not for escape, but to give my children a home where they could grow up without confusion, a place where love was not something you feared. As the new year approached, I felt ready. I had gathered everything I needed. I spoke to a local shelter that helped women transition to safe housing. I knew the steps. I had support. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for something better. The morning I left, the sky was pale gray, the kind of soft, quiet sky that doesn't promise sunshine, but also doesn't threaten rain. It felt like a pause between two chapters. I stood in the kitchen and looked around one last time. Everything looked the same. Same fridge, same kettle, same chipped corner on the counter. But I didn't feel the same. I had changed. Jonas was asleep. The boys were dressed and ready. I had packed their small bags with care, familiar toys, school clothes, their favorite books. I didn't tell them much, just that we were going to stay somewhere new for a little while. They didn't ask many questions. I think, deep inside, they already understood more than I ever gave them credit for. As we stepped out the door, I didn't look back. I didn't cry. I didn't feel fear. What I felt was something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. The place we moved into wasn't big. It was a small apartment arranged by the shelter program. Clean, safe, and quiet. There was one bedroom for the boys and a small space for me. The walls were plain, the furniture simple. But the silence was gentle. It didn't hurt. The boys settled in quickly. Children are like that. They adjust faster than we do. They asked if Daddy was coming. I said no, not now. Maybe one day for visits. They didn't cry. Instead, they seemed lighter, like something invisible had been taken off their shoulders. In the weeks that followed, I learned how to breathe again. I found work cleaning rooms at a local hotel. It wasn't what I had dreamed of, but it gave me income, purpose, and new faces that greeted me kindly. I began talking to people again, not pretending, but truly speaking. Some days were hard, but hard felt better than numb. Marianne continued to check in with me. I didn't attend formal sessions anymore, but we spoke on the phone now and then. She reminded me I was not alone, that healing takes time. I believed her. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, I sat by the window with a notebook. I had started writing down moments, things I had felt, things I wanted to remember. Not the pain, but the lessons. I wanted to build a story I could share with Leo and Ben when they were older. I didn't want them to see only the broken past. I wanted them to know about the strength that followed. I wrote about the glass on the kitchen floor, the towel soaked in red, the counseling room, the first moment I realized I deserved peace. These were not stories of weakness. They were stories of waking up. Sometimes, late at night, I would remember the house. I would remember Jonas's silence. I would wonder if he missed us, but I didn't wonder too long, because even if he did, I knew he hadn't loved me in the way I needed to be loved. Not really. I stopped checking his social media. I stopped asking myself if he had changed. That wasn't my journey to follow anymore. The boys continued to grow. Leo joined the school football team. Ben started painting. I saw them becoming their own people, curious, kind, expressive. I saw how they looked at me differently now, with trust, with calm. And I saw something in myself too, a woman I had forgotten. There were days when I felt tired, days when the past still whispered, but it no longer controlled me. One Sunday morning we walked through a nearby park. The boys ran ahead laughing. I sat on a bench, letting the sun warm my face. I watched them run, their small bodies full of energy, their voices rising like music. A woman sat beside me. She had 2 children of her own. We exchanged smiles and a few quiet words. Nothing deep. But it felt good to be seen without having to explain who I was or where I had been. That night I made dinner and we ate together, the 3 of us. It was a simple meal, but the room felt full. There was no shouting, no silence full of blame, just small talk, crumbs on the table, and laughter that belonged to us. Sometimes I still ask myself what would have happened if I had stayed. I think I would have disappeared, little by little. I think my boys would have grown up confused about love. I think I would have taught them to accept less. But I didn't stay. I left. And in doing so, I found something I never expected to have again. Myself. I found strength in the quiet, in the soft rhythm of new routines. I woke up early, made breakfast, walked the boys to school, and caught the bus to work. I liked watching the streets pass by through the window. Each stop, each corner felt like a step away from who I used to be. There was no big celebration, no loud moment of transformation. Healing came slowly. In the way I looked in the mirror and saw a woman trying again. In the way I walked with my head a little higher. In the way I answered questions with more certainty. I had spent years feeling like I was standing still. Now, even small movements felt like progress. I started keeping a small garden on the windowsill, a few herbs, a flower pot. Nothing fancy, but it gave me joy. Every new leaf felt like hope growing in plain sight. One afternoon, I was folding clothes when Ben came in with a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing. Me, him, and Leo holding hands in a field. Above us, the words, "Safe with Mom." I held it for a long time. There were still hard days when I worried about money, when the boys asked why their father hadn't called, when I missed what could have been, but I never regretted the choice I made. I joined a support group for women who had left similar situations. At first, I didn't speak. I listened. I cried. Slowly, I shared my story, and when I spoke, I felt the weight inside me lift, piece by piece. These women understood, and in their eyes, I saw the reflection of my own courage. Jonas reached out once, after a few months. He sent a message asking to see the boys. My heart raced when I saw his name. For a moment I was afraid again, but then I breathed. I called a family counselor and asked for help arranging a meeting. I made sure it would be safe and calm. I was not the same woman who used to hide her pain in silence. Now, I had boundaries. Leo was quiet after that meeting. Ben was more open. He said his dad seemed less angry now. I nodded, but I didn't answer right away. I was still learning how to talk about Jonas without carrying the past into the present. What mattered more was how the boys felt now. Safe, loved, heard. Seasons changed. We painted the small apartment in soft colors. I bought a second-hand table and let the boys help build it. It was uneven, but it was ours. We celebrated birthdays with small cakes and handmade cards. We laughed more. I no longer needed permission to feel joy. One evening, I stood at the window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed love meant staying silent, staying small, staying broken. I thought about how far she had come. I whispered a quiet thank you to her, because she stayed long enough to protect her children, and then she was brave enough to walk away. That's where my story ends, not in rescue, not in revenge, but in rediscovery. I didn't leave to escape. I left to return to myself.